Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, which is being held by the Center on Global Energy Policy of Columbia University. My name is Michael Gerard. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School, where I teach courses on environmental law and energy regulation, and I direct the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. This event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit questions on Twitter by using the hashtag CGEP, C-G-E-P live, and the Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. You can also submit questions by email to energypolicyevents@columbia.edu. Today, we're going to be discussing building a new grid without new legislation. First, a few words on why we need a new grid. President-elect Biden campaigned on a goal of a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035. The U.S. power sector is now 38% carbon-free, about half from renewables and half from nuclear. Moving from 38% to 100% will require an enormous increase in renewable generation capacity from the current 1,100 gigawatts to about 3,000 gigawatts, according to a new report from the Zero Carbon Energy Project. Much of this new generation will be in areas that are far from where the power is needed. So the massive program of renewables construction will have to be accompanied by a massive program of new transmission. And we need the grid to have much greater functionality in many ways than it does now. First, I'd like to call on Dr. Melissa Lott to give some welcoming remarks. Melissa is a senior research scholar at CGEP, where she leads the Power Sector and Renewables Research Initiative. She's worked as an engineer and advisor in the US, Europe, and Asia for more than 15 years. She specializes in technology and policy research, working to increase our understanding of the impacts of our energy system on air pollution and public health. Melissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for being our moderator today for this really exciting and interesting event. And also thanks to everyone who's joining us online. It's great to see those numbers going up, and I'm looking forward to your questions and this whole discussion. I also want to thank our partners for today's event, the NYU School of Law's Institute for Policy Integrity, including a number of the co-authors on this report. And this report is focused on a really important and incredibly timely topic, as Michael just outlined. When we look at the evidence, the research, the analysis, the hard numbers around how we can most effectively transition to an affordable and zero carbon economy in order to protect public health in our communities and mitigate the impacts of climate change, one thing that becomes quite clear is that we need more electricity and we need it to be zero carbon quickly. And if we look at zero carbon electricity being the backbone of a net zero economy, if we look at that future, what also becomes clear is that the rapid transformation that we're already undergoing in the power sector needs to accelerate. And when we look at those technologies that we need on board, sure, they're on the supply side. On the supply side, we need firm dispatchable power plants, we need energy storage, and we need rapidly increasing amounts of renewable electricity. But we also need that backbone to be robust and flexible, and that backbone is the power grid. The transition has been supported over the last decade by steep cost declines for wind, solar, and battery technologies, as well as cheap natural gas produced via hydraulic fracturing. But when we look at the investments, as this paper that's being released tomorrow by the Center on Global Energy Policy and NYU, when we look at the investments that have been made in our grid, they have been quite lagging. And if I sum it up, if I really look at all the evidence and take away all the noise and just focus on the signal, the reality is that we need new long distance transmission lines if we want to keep this transition affordable and if we want to do it on a timeline that's going to both mitigate climate change and protect public health. And this paper seeks to explain how, in absence of action from Congress, which is not guaranteed, what any administration, the Biden administration, could do to reach this 2035 target or other targets. Whatever date it is, this is a discussion of the authorities that we have in place to say, okay, how do we advance the grid? How do we invest in it and make it support the future that we want for the power system, which again is the backbone of decarbonization? You know, on a personal note, when I joined the Center on Global Energy Policy just over a year ago to set up this power sector and renewables research initiative, the goal was to create a program that's going to advance smart, actionable and evidence-based energy and climate solutions through research, education, and dialogue. This paper and today's event, done in partnership with NYU Schools of Law's Institute for Policy Integrity, it is certainly all of these things. It's designed to provide insights, and it's designed to be useful to policymakers in the format and timeframe that is needed for them to make informed decisions. So with that, I'll hand it off to Michael and the rest of our speakers. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. We're now going to hear from the two authors of the report, or at least two of the authors of the report that's the principal subject of today's program, Justin Gunlock and Sam Walsh. Justin Gunlock is a senior attorney at the Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU Law School, where his work focuses on energy and climate policy. Before joining Policy Integrity, he was a member of the policy development team at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, a staff attorney working with me at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, a staff attorney and teaching fellow at Georgetown Law School's Environmental Litigation Clinic, and an associate at Crowell & Moring. He's published widely on energy and environmental law and policy with a particular focus on climate change. Sam Walsh is a partner at Harris, Wiltshire, and Granis LLP, focusing his practice on representing energy sector clients before federal and state agencies and in the federal courts. Until December of 2016, Sam served as Deputy General Counsel for Energy Policy at the Department of Energy, where he was responsible for legal matters related to the department's electric, fossil energy, and civilian nuclear programs. Prior to his government service, Sam was a member of the energy regulatory practice at a major international law firm based in Washington, where he represented a diverse range of clients before FERC and the Department of Energy. So now I'll turn it over to Justin and Sam.
Well, thanks so much, Michael. And first of all, we would like to say a huge thank you to CJEP and especially to Dr. Melissa Lott for making this event a reality and for assembling an absolute murderer's row of great panelists today. We'd also like to thank quickly NYU's Institute for Policy Integrity, which among other things has supported this paper from the beginning and has shown the great judgment to have employed all three of my fantastic co-authors at least some point during the development of this paper. And on that point, I want to note that there are four of us that wrote this paper, but only two of us who are going to be presenting it here today. Avi Zevin and Isabel Carey are not presenting, but between them are responsible for certainly more than half of the good ideas in this paper and probably none of the mistakes. So you're stuck with me and Justin. And back to the folks at CJEP for a moment. Among the other great pieces of advice that they provided for us from Melissa and her colleague Matt Robinson was that we should hold this event now in December rather than October, which is what we had initially proposed. And as it happens, holding the event now is perfect timing. President-elect Biden is going to enter office in just over a month. He has declared confronting the climate crisis a top priority of his administration, and rightfully so. But he is going to need to advance that priority in a highly constrained legislative environment. So a critical question that we need to be asking across the federal agencies right now is, what can the new administration do to advance the climate agenda while relying on existing legal authorities that don't require new congressional action? And that's what this paper is about. We decided to write this paper because we kept encountering knowledgeable people in our field working in energy and climate policy who know, that accept the premise that long distance high voltage transmission lines are critical to meeting our climate goals, but who nevertheless have resigned themselves to the notion that there's nothing the federal government can do. And this view, which is conventional wisdom, I guess, in some quarters, is that the transmission authorities added by Congress in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 have been gutted by the courts, and therefore that the only hope now is through new legislation. But the argument of our paper is that this conventional wisdom is wrong. We argue that the backstop siting authority contained in section 1221 of EPAct 2005 and the third-party partnership authority provided in section 1222 both remain viable, and that there are things the new administration can and should do to advance their use. Now, we have no illusions that this will be easy. These authorities are far from perfect, and the new administration will need to defend their use before a judiciary that is increasingly wary of these types of government initiatives. But our argument is that in the absence of a legislative solution, or while we wait for a legislative solution, perhaps optimistically, the administration should make as much progress as it possibly can using these existing authorities. And one important clarification, when we talk about getting transmission built today, we are really talking about long distance, high voltage transmission facilities, and in particular, those facilities that traverse across the footprints of the regional planning entities, and in some cases, projects that connect the eastern and western interconnections together. There actually has been quite a bit of transmission investment over the past decade, but the overwhelming share of it has gone to facilities designated as local projects or reliability projects in the order 1,000 planning processes, and have been built by incumbent utilities. So these are fundamentally smaller projects that cover less ground. But it's the long distance, high voltage facilities that are not really getting built today, and also are the same ones that hold the greatest potential to advance the decarbonization of the electric sector in a way that's quicker and less expensive than alternatives that don't use that kind of transmission solution. So this first slide shows the results of the now famous SEAMS study. The top row shows scenarios consisting of build outs modeled with 3 high voltage direct current interconnections between the eastern and western interconnections. The second row shows a national scale HVDC network or macro grid. The study showed that each of these build outs would yield benefit to cost ratios significantly greater than 1, even under pessimistic scenarios about renewable energy development. Under the scenario modeling fast growth in renewable energy, these projects yield benefit to cost ratios as high as 3 to 1, which is shows that there's just immense value to be unlocked for the public in getting these things built. Next slide. The next slide shows the result of another study published just last week by 2 researchers at MIT. The lines on this map look a little different because they use some different assumptions, but the fundamental result is the same. If you want to decarbonize the grid at the lowest cost, you need transmission. And this study modeled the cost of reaching a zero carbon grid and found that the most aggressive transmission build out, depicted here with high voltage interconnection between the eastern and western interconnections, yields savings in the bundled costs of energy approaching $40 a megawatt hour as compared to the base case. So again, huge value potentially unlocked by these high voltage interconnections across high voltage facilities crossing interconnections and crossing the regional planning entities. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, if these long distance transmission lines are so great, then why aren't they getting built today? And there are a few reasons for that. But one important reason, and the reason that's the subject of our paper, has to do with state siting laws. In general, if you want to build a transmission line, you need regulatory approval from each state that the transmission line traverses. This state-by-state requirement has proven to be a significant hindrance for long-distance transmission lines that cross multiple states, like the ones that are kind of posited in this diagram on the screen now. The requirement to get regulatory approval in each state adds cost and delay, and in some cases has proven an insurmountable barrier when one state or another has denied approval outright. The problem is especially acute in states that are traversed by a transmission line, but which are neither at the source nor the sink of the line. Regulators in those states may see little reason to approve a project or to authorize eminent domain for a project if their state is going to neither get the economic benefit of hosting the generation nor receive the energy itself. Congress recognized this problem and in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 created 2 pathways to get transmission built that do not require state approval. The first of these is the so-called Backstop Siting Authority, is going to be described by my co-author, Justin Gunlock. Justin, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. All right. Yes, as Sam mentioned, I'm going to cover one of the three types of authority that we highlight in our paper, and one of two that we're going to talk about today before turning the mic back to Sam to talk about the other one. I'll be discussing the federal siting authority provided for in Section 216. As Sam mentioned, Congress created this authority in 2005. Basically, it empowers FERC to step in and permit construction of a transmission project where a state agency would not do so. But it only empowers FERC to do this in particular circumstances. As you can see on the slide, there are two key features of Section 216. The first directs DOE to designate national interest energy transmission corridors in appropriate locations. And the second gives FERC backstop permitting authority within those corridors, meaning that there and only there, FERC can displace a state's permitting authority. I'm going to introduce each of these, note how they have fared so far, and also mention how we think DOE and FERC could apply them now. I am not going to talk through all of our recommendations about Section 216 or the other authorities, but I encourage you to take a look at the table on pages 10 and 11 of our paper, which I believe is going to be released today, not tomorrow, but today. That table lists all 20 recommendations that appear in the paper. About half of those relate to Section 216. So Section 216A is the one that governs transmission corridors. It directs DOE to conduct studies of electric transmission congestion and to do so in consultation with affected states. It also directs DOE to issue one or more reports that may designate, don't have to, one or more transmission corridors. The defining language in 216A2 is, quote, any geographic area experiencing electric energy capacity constraints or congestion that adversely affect consumers. That is to be the definition of what might become a transmission corridor. So two things to note here. First, the relationship between the study and the designation report is somewhat loose. DOE must issue a report following a study, and the law clearly envisions that a study will inform the subsequent designation report. But DOE does not need to wait for a new study to issue a new report and make new designations. Second, 216A directs DOE to base designation on constraints. That's a term from the Act, as well as congestion. And it invites DOE to use other criteria too, such as whether a designation would be in the interest of national energy policy. So DOE has a lot of discretion under 216A regarding where and on what basis it decides to designate a corridor. A 2006 study informed the 2007 designations of two corridors, one in the Southwest and one in the Mid-Atlantic. As you can see from the map, or maps, they were each very big. Those corridors' legality was challenged by a very long list of parties, states, state utility commissions, utilities, and NGOs. A split panel of the Ninth Circuit vacated both of these on two grounds. The court said that DOE did not adequately consult with states about the study, not the designations, but the study, and that DOE did not conduct a review of the environmental impacts of corridor designation pursuant to the National Environmental Policy Act. Now, DOE argued that its designations would have no environmental impact. It was just designating locations where projects might be planned and might qualify as being subject to FERC's backstop authority, but the court disagreed that this made NEPA review unnecessary. So this decision by the Ninth Circuit does not prevent DOE from designating more corridors. It just clarifies some of what DOE must do if it wants to make more designations in the future. But since 2011, when the Ninth Circuit decided the case, DOE has not recommended any further corridor designations. The authority has sat dormant. So what should we do now? As I mentioned before, our report contains multiple recommendations, and I'm just going to note a couple of those here. First, DOE should revise or supplement the 2020 congestion study that it just issued in the fall. For instance, the initial version of that study only identifies instances of present congestion. We think it should identify instances of both present and foreseeable future congestion. Also, the initial version of that study asserts that it would take a new statement from Congress to allow DOE to draw a connection between the role of new transmission in enabling energy transition to a cleaner grid and grid constraints and congestion. We think this misreads the law, which lists several factors in addition to constraints and congestion. Those include whether transmission development would foster economic growth, whether it would support more diverse energy supplies, and whether it would fulfill national energy policy. We also recommend that DOE should designate one or several new corridors, possibly without waiting for the study. When doing so, DOE should prioritize corridors that would connect large, constrained, renewable resources or potential to load, and recognizing that even just designating an area can make parties with an interest there nervous, we think DOE should try to confine its corridor designations in contrast to the two from 2007 to avoid a groundswell of opposition in locations where it's unlikely that you're actually going to see a project proposed or built. And in a similar vein, and recognizing the items highlighted by the Ninth Circuit's decision, we recommend that DOE pursue an unmistakably meaningful consultation with states. So cross all the T's, dot all the I's. We also recommend that DOE and FERC at least consider delegating the task of corridor designation to FERC. This is a bit sticky, and others might discuss it today, but for now, I'll just throw out that teaser. Moving on to section 216B, which governs backstop siting authority. If a project is to be located in a designated corridor and it meets the statutory criteria, then FERC can take over from a state the task of deciding whether to permit that project. The two sets of criteria that guide FERC in this are listed on page 23 of our report. So as soon as that hits the internet, you can flip to page 23. Threshold criteria are capacious and they are not especially contentious. For instance, one is that a project must be consistent with the public interest, and another is that the project would reduce congestion and benefit consumers. So there are lots of ways that a project might do those things. Some of the state inaction criteria, however, are contentious, especially the one that the Piedmont decision focused on. This is the Fourth Circuit decision that vacated FERC Order 689. The criterion at issue there was in section 216B4. And that says that FERC can issue a construction permit, notwithstanding state refusal, if the state has, quote, withheld approval for more than 1 year. So the question that the court faced was, does this encompass a state denying approval because that denial is effective for more than 1 year after the application was submitted? Or does this really only aim at dawdling and exclude instances of forthright and timely denial by a state permitting authority? The majority of the Fourth Circuit panel said that withheld approval for more than 1 year excludes outright denial, that they are distinct. Among other things, the deciding judges thought that if Congress had wanted to allow FERC to just undo a permit denial, it would have said so more clearly. One judge, Judge Traxler, dissented. He disagreed with the majority about how they read the dictionary, and he also disagreed about the premise that Congress disagreed with the premise that Congress had wanted FERC to be able to overturn a variety of different forms of state refusal, but not the one that was most obvious and straightforward, which is just outright denial. He emphasized that this reading of withhold approval would encompass deny approval and would be more consistent with the purpose of the statute. It is important to emphasize here that FERC's response to the Fourth Circuit decision was to oppose review by the Supreme Court. It opposed a grant of cert, and the court denied cert. So as you can see on this map, that leaves most of the country untouched by the Fourth Circuit's interpretation. And FERC has not attempted to raise the argument in another jurisdiction. So this portion of the country is governed by that decision. The rest is not. As for what FERC should do, we recommend that FERC would adopt a new order to replace 689. That order should explain how projects that connect constrained renewable potential to load would meet the threshold criteria in the statute. We think the order should interpret withhold to encompass express denial, at least outside of the Fourth Circuit. We recommend that the order allow permit applicants to begin the pre-filing process with FERC even before FERC makes a determination about whether it will use its backstop authority or leave the state process undisturbed. So this is a parallel filing by the project developer so that when the developer files for a permit with state authorities, it should also be allowed to go ahead and begin filing with FERC, whatever would be required if FERC were to ultimately be the authority that decided the project. And we also recommend that the order would encourage developers to seek federal siting whenever state regulatory requirements seem to match the other state inaction criteria listed in 216B. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Sam.
All right, thank you, Justin. So next I'm going to talk about Section 1222 of EPAct 2005. And Section 1222 works on a very different kind of model. The Backstop Siting Authority is sort of a traditional regulatory model where the applicant, if they get the permit, has the authority to build the project, to overcome state law, and to use eminent domain if necessary. Section 1222 is where the developer can partner with the federal government and specifically with the Western Area Power Administration or the Southwestern Power Administration within the Department of Energy in the development and ownership of new transmission lines. And Section 1222 allows a transmission project to avoid the need for state siting approval because the project effectively becomes a federal project by virtue of its joint federal ownership, and is therefore, has the advantage of federal sovereign immunity with respect to state law. So the history of Section 1222 in practice is that DOE first put out an RFI seeking interest in 1222 back in 2010. The only project to advance in the process with DOE was the Clean Lines Plains and Eastern project, which is the subject of Russell Gold's book Superpower, which is a great read, and I recommend it. That's also a little map of that project is on the screen now. It was going to run 700 miles from the Oklahoma Panhandle to Tennessee. It would have enabled the delivery of roughly 4,000 megawatts of wind power from the best wind resource area in the country, i.e. the Panhandle region of Oklahoma and Texas, to the TVA service territory where it could access markets in the Southeast that don't have as good wind resources. And as you can see in this map, the Clean Line Plains and Eastern project was to go through Arkansas. And Arkansas denied Clean Line a permit. And so without DOE's participation through Section 1222, the project would not have had a path forward. After several years of environmental review, DOE decided to participate with Clean Line in this project. It announced its decision in the spring of 2016. It put out a lengthy explanation for its reasons for doing so, and also published the agreement that it had reached with Clean Line, which kind of delineated the terms of their joint participation. And under that agreement, it's important to point out that Clean Line had agreed to pay all the costs of the project. And so, the Department of Energy didn't have to pay anything. And in fact, Clean Line had agreed to commit a slice of their project revenues to a fund that would help pay for capital expenditures on federal hydropower facilities that were badly underfunded. After the department issued its decision, it was sued by a group of Arkansas landowners, and DOE won that case, decided by federal district court in Arkansas. The case is called Downwind LLC. And most notably, the landowners challenged a fundamental aspect of DOE's reading of the statute. They argued that Section 1222 does not shield transmission projects from the need to obtain state siting authority. The court rejected that argument. It sided with DOE's explanation and held that nothing in Section 1222 changes the basic fact that the federal government is immune to state laws. And thus, so long as the federal agency is the one owning the transmission lines under Section 1222, the project does not need state approval. Ultimately, however, and for those of you who are reading Superpower, this is a spoiler alert. The project did not succeed. And there were two reasons why. First, the project ran into problems at TVA. As I mentioned, the project was to interconnect in the TVA service territory, and a critical part of the business case was that TVA would sign up for at least some of the energy coming over the line. But despite being offered rock bottom prices on delivered energy, ultimately TVA chose not to sign up. Second, and I think relatedly, towards the end of 2017, the Trump administration ultimately pulled out of the deal. So I think that even if TVA had signed up, there was a pretty good chance that the project wouldn't have been able to go forward anyway. So what do we make of this experience? Well, To me, there's no question that getting a project done under Section 1222 would be very difficult. But there are reasons to conclude it could be easier this time around. And why do we think that? And basically, it's because the DOE has already had the experience of doing this kind of project once. For one, DOE has already done the work of interpreting the statute, applying the statute to a particular project and having that interpretation upheld in court. Now, the district court's decision in Downwind LLC wouldn't be binding precedent on future courts, but it would be helpful, and it would give both DOE and applicants some confidence that the program stands on solid legal footing. Second, DOE and Clean Line already negotiated a massive agreement for how their joint participation would work in a project like this, and that agreement is now in the public domain. So future Section 1222 agreements, they wouldn't need to use the same agreement again, but it provides a template to work from. And I think from a developer's point of view at the beginning of the process, shed some light on what participation may look like at the end of the day and might lend some confidence. So we think that Section 1222 is worth trying again, given the massive challenge that we all face, and the incoming administration's ambition with respect to countering the climate crisis. This is something that we need to try. And so the paper recommends that DOE issue a new RFI soliciting interest in Section 1222. And that the RFI proposed some streamlined procedures that would allow the environmental review for projects that apply to begin more quickly. So lastly, some concluding thoughts on our presentation. The title of our paper is Building a New Grid Without New Law. But the truth is we've only covered one slice of what the new administration will need to think about if it wants to get new transmission built. The slice that we've covered is overcoming state siting barriers, but there are other perhaps equally important issues that the administration will need to grapple with. One is federal permitting. Long distance transmission lines, particularly in the Western United States, will typically traverse at least some federal lands and will need use permits from the resource agencies and will need to go through NEPA review. So the new administration is going to need to ensure that when it comes to these national interest transmission lines, that the permitting agencies act expeditiously and that they conduct their reviews in parallel. Second, an issue we haven't covered here at all today, but which is a huge issue facing these types of projects, is financing. As we discuss in our paper, but haven't really spoken about much today, the Western Area Power Administration has loan authority that could be helpful in some cases. But at a more general level, it's going to fall to FERC to consider ways to enable these types of high value interregional projects to get cost recovery so they can actually get built. Order 1000 required the regional planning entities to consider interregional projects, but all these years later, not a single interregional project has been built through Order 1000. So we hope that FERC can take this issue up. And we also think that there's a potential nexus between what we've talked about today and Order 1000 reform. For example, it would be reasonable, I think, for FERC to at least consider implementing special procedures for evaluating cost allocation for projects that are located in national interest electric transmission corridors designated by DOE or by FERC if FERC had the delegated authority. And lastly, we can't forget about politics. So in a moment, we're going to hear from a panel consisting entirely of folks that have operated at the very highest level of where politics and transmission policy intersect. And I'm curious about what they have to say on this topic. I'll venture one thought, which is that if the new administration is going to make these transmission authorities work, it's going to need to embrace a much more proactive and less reactive style of politics when it comes to transmission development. I think one thing that means is driving home in their messaging that these projects are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that they're critical to decarbonizing the grid. I think that's something that experts understand, but that the public may not understand in general. And second, the administration needs to really drive home that these projects are going to create jobs. President-elect Biden has said that when he thinks about climate change, he thinks about jobs. Well, these transmission projects create a lot of jobs, and there are things the federal government can do to ensure that they're good jobs. The federal government can require that these projects pay prevailing wage, can require that they proceed using project labor agreements. So the administration can think strategically from the beginning about the durable political coalitions that can see these projects across the finish line. So that concludes our presentation, and I think we're gonna I guess I kick it back to Michael, who's gonna introduce our esteemed panel.
Right. Thank you, Sam and Justin. So the report is actually being issued today. Links to it have been put in the chat and on the Zoom and are going up by Twitter and are going to be on the CJEP website. Many ways you can get it. We're now going to hear from 4 very distinguished experts in the energy field with their thoughts on the report. I'll introduce each one before he or she speaks. Each one will talk for about 5 minutes. After we're all done with that, we'll have the Q&A session. Once again, for those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit questions by Twitter using the hashtag CJEPLive and the Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy, or you can send an email to energypolicyevents@columbia.edu. So first we'll hear from David Hill. David is an adjunct research scholar at CJEP. From 2012 to 2018, he served as executive vice president and general counsel of NRG Energy, which at the time was one of the largest generators of both conventional and renewable electricity in the US. Prior to joining NRG in 2012, David was a partner and co-head of the energy practice at Sidley Austin. From 2005 to 2009, he served as general counsel of the U.S. Department of Energy, and for 3 years before that was DOE's deputy general counsel for energy policy. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's great to be here today. Rarely, actually, never do I get the chance to talk about an article that talks about so many things that I was personally involved in, as with this one. But which is one reason why I'm very much looking forward to talking about it for a few minutes. I will say I think the article is incredibly strong. It's exhaustively researched. Has comprehensive recommendations, and which I'm particularly grateful about that. It doesn't just complain. It has very detailed recommendations, and I think that's excellent. And I think it deserves serious consideration. Just a few thoughts, and I'll just confine my thoughts to a few topics here. I agree that Section 1221 and 1222 of the Energy Policy Act of '05 are very powerful authorities. And they haven't been used to their full extent. There's a lot more that they could be used for and should be used for. I think with respect to Section 1221, Section 216 of the Federal Power Act, I was integrally involved in the designation of the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors back in '06 and '07. And I know the courts have decided that we didn't do that right, but we thought very carefully about whether to designate broad or narrow corridors, and we decided to designate the broader ones because we thought that doing narrow ones would really conflate the two separate functions that are laid out with respect to both the designation of corridors and then the actual permitting of a particular transmission line, which is authority assigned to FERC. I will say that they're designating broad corridors is problematic for the reason that the authors note in the article. But I think that doing it the other way would entail some significant difficulties. One thing that the authors note is that that DOE ought to delegate its authority to FERC, and that FERC that would actually help expedite things. That FERC is good at citing linear projects, but I think it's clear that's not actually what Congress wanted. Senator Domenici, Senator Bingaman, Congressman Barton, the authors of the EPAct 05, they knew very well what the functions of DOE were and what the capabilities of DOE and FERC were, and they separated out those two functions. The authors note that Senator Bingaman in particular was wanted the functions separated, but the article notes that that's no longer the prevailing view of Congress. That obviously Senator Bingaman isn't, a United States senator anymore. And yet in other places in the article they talk about what congressional intent was. I do think that this is one where Congress thought very carefully about what it wanted, and it assigned these functions separately. And I guess I think that that DOE delegating the authority to FERC. I do think that certainly the delegation of authority of FERC would, or DOE would permit that. I don't think that's consistent with what Congress wanted. I think I also think that the idea of DOE designating corridors based on specific projects, I think that yes, I mean that might actually expedite the overall, it has the potential to expedite it. But I also think that if DOE were to do that, it would be inconsistent with one thing that the authors note, which is that the corridors could be designated with an environmental assessment as opposed to an environmental impact statement under NEPA. And I don't think in the end that would probably work if a particular project was the focus of the corridor designation. I will note that I think that both the cases that are discussed in the article, California Wilderness and Piedmont Environmental Council, that deal with Section 216, were wrongly decided by the U.S. Courts of Appeals, and I fully agree with what the authors note about the idea of non-acquiescence in with FERC's action as to the Piedmont Environmental Council, because that decision by the Fourth Circuit, I mean, is just, in my view, totally and completely wrong. Stuck with it in the Fourth Circuit, but not in the rest of the country. One final comment, and I realize I'm already over my 5 minutes, Michael, but one other thing I'll note on the Section 1222, the authorities of the power marketing administrations, that's a very powerful legal authority, modeled on the successful experience with Path 15 out in California. The real lesson of that, though, is their Path 15 was a priority of President Bush and of Secretary Abraham, and it got built. They pushed it forward, and that line was in service by 2004. And that the main constraint in using 1222 is not legal authority. The legal authority is incredibly strong. And when I was actually representing Clean Line Energy Partners and trying to talk DOE into using that authority for the Plains and Eastern project, the legal authority is incredibly strong. It comes down to political will. It also comes down to actually getting through the NEPA process quickly, which took 3 years in the context of the Plains and Eastern project, and the entire NEPA process, in my view, needs to actually be expedited. So glad to answer questions later, but thank you again for the opportunity to talk today.
Thanks very much, David. Our next speaker is Cheryl LaFleur. Cheryl is currently a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy and also a member of the board of directors of the Independent System Operator of New England. Previously, she was one of the longest serving commissioners on FERC. She was nominated by President Obama in 2010 and again in 2014. She served as chair in 2014, 2015, plus 2 stints as acting chair, and was a member of FERC until August of 2019. Before that, Cheryl had more than 20 years experience as a leader in the electric and natural gas industries, including service as executive vice president and acting CEO of National Grid USA. Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Michael. Happy to be here. I feel like I'm part of the double act with David, since he was at DOE and I was at FERC when a lot of the events discussed in the paper took place. I certainly agree that more long distance, high voltage transmission is needed to connect location constrained renewable generations to population centers if we're going to come close to utilizing the potential the US has for renewable energy. And I also agree and have seen close up many times that state siting and permitting authority, coupled with the influence of incumbent utilities that may oppose new lines coming through their territory, have been a major barrier to long distance transmission across multiple states. I was not at FERC when Piedmont was decided by the Fourth Circuit. I got there in the immediate aftermath. I was there when the Ninth Circuit delivered the second half of the 1-2 punch with the California wilderness case. And I would say when that case came down, it kind of took the wind out of our sails of whatever we were trying to do about Piedmont. And since that time, I have definitely been part of the conventional wisdom. I have testified in Congress more than once that Congress should rewrite Section 216 to restore effective FERC backstop siting authority. So you can see how effective that has been. Given the unlikelihood of congressional action, I think this paper could not be more timely. I think it's well considered and well written and well researched to really carefully explain the detailed options available under existing law. I believe that Piedmont was wrongly decided and does not comport with the legislative history or the intent of the law. I think if FERC reissued regulations on backstop siting and recreated the transmission siting department they had stood up in the projects group at the time of the original law, and tried to find another test case outside the Fourth Circuit, it could be a slow path to resolution, but it could help a lot in the long run. Assuming that FERC was able to establish the possibility of effective backstop authority, I think that could have a significant effect in helping interstate transmission get sited and constructed. Not just when the authority was actually used. I think the mere threat of FERC having the authority to come in and cite something as a backstop could encourage states to come together to find acceptable sites and help get lines built. I do think, however, that FERC backstop authority would not be a silver bullet. As the article notes, both Clean Line and DOE, as far as I can see, did everything in conformance with Section 1222 with respect to the Plains and Eastern project, and were not derailed by anything in the law, but by political opposition at the state and at the federal level, especially Senator Alexander. I think we can expect that states that are opposed to transmission lines will find a way to use their existing authority, even if FERC has the siting authority, their authority over clean water crossing permits or other local authorities to make life very difficult for project sponsors. And we have certainly seen this in the area of gas pipelines. 10 years ago, people always said, look how many gas pipelines are being built. That's because FERC has siting and permitting and eminent domain authority. If only FERC had that authority with transmission, lots of transmission could be built. That's certainly true to a point, but recently, as many states have been strongly opposed to gas pipelines because it conflicts with their perception of their climate objectives or for other reasons, many pipelines have been canceled due to state opposition and state withholding of necessary ancillary permits, even if FERC approved them. So all of this, in my view, points to the continuing need to satisfy state authorities and citizens that the proposed facilities are in the best interest of citizens in their states, to really get them on board, at least enough on board to accept FERC action. I think that there's a few ways to do that. One is in the states where climate mitigation is part of state policy, which is, I believe, about 29 states, tying the projects to state climate policy, giving the state credit toward its carbon goals for allowing a project. Secondly, providing real tangible benefits to the customers of the states. We saw Hydro-Quebec do this to the state of Maine, where they voted out discounts to Maine customers in order to get the New England Clean Energy Connect, which is still not built, but is still now on track through the state of Maine after the state of New Hampshire didn't want power to go through their state. and encouraging states to work together at the regional level on projects where they each kind of one hand washes the other, because you come up with a portfolio of projects where there's a little something for everything, which is what MISO did with the multi-value projects, put together a portfolio. So Michigan got a little and this one got a little and that one got a little, and they kind of went through together. Not easy to do, particularly with these monster HVDC projects, hard to kind of portfolio them with something of equal value. So that leads, I feel like I should say a couple words about Order 1000. I was at FERC when Order number 1000 was voted out and was deeply involved. The concept was that it would require regional planning and ex-ante cost allocation, and that planning had to consider transmission that was for public policy purposes, such as to connect renewables. It would require interregional coordination. The interregional requirements were much softer than the regional requirements. It was said that the interregional part of Order 1000 was like the regional requirements in Order 990. And once regional planning and cost allocation was up and running and everyone saw the benefits, FERC would come back a few years later, just as it did a few years after 990, and vote the next rule that would require interregional planning and cost allocation, just as Order 1000 required regional planning and cost allocation. That was very much the plan. But the third part of it was taking away the incumbent right of first refusal for an incumbent utility to build transmission lines across its territory. If I could go back in a time tunnel, I would have insisted more strongly than I tried to do then that that be in a separate rule, because that so angered the electric utility constituency that it really has had a tremendous amount of a bad impact on the effectiveness of the whole rule. What we've seen instead, and I'm on record saying that I think in some areas, electric companies have actually built more of the kinds of lines that are exempt from regional bidding out and competitive transmission processes to avoid competitive transmission processes, which is the exact opposite of what the rule was intended, which was to have more high voltage, long distance lines subject to competitive processes. The difficulty for FERC held a tech conference on this in 2016. FERC already has a record of more things it can do to Order 1000. The problem in it's won lawsuit after lawsuit on that the taking away the right of first refusal was a matter of important to the public interest. So to come back and say, oh, never mind, we're not going to do that now would be very hard. Rather, they have to kind of walk through it and try to put pieces of the rule back together. And maybe we'll see that in the new FERC. So I will stop there. Thank the authors again and look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Our next speaker is Rob Gramlich. Rob is a founder and president of Grid Strategies, LLC, where he provides economic policy analysis for clients on electric transmission and power markets in pursuit of low-cost decarbonization. Rob oversaw transmission and power market policy for the American Wind Energy Association from 2005 through 2016. He was economic advisor to FERC Chairman Pat Wood III from 2001 to 2005, and before that, a senior economist at PJM Interconnection. Rob.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. It's an honor to be here. And one of my other roles is I serve as Executive Director of Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, which focuses exactly on these issues: how to get large-scale transmission built to access the clean renewable resources that will be important for decarbonization, as well as just they are the least cost resources, even if you consider the transmission required to access them. I'm really going to make two general points. Number one, this is a fantastic paper. It is truly excellent, and it is a roadmap and a cookbook for what I think the Department of Energy in particular should do. I hope many people in the next administration carry this paper around with them. The second point I'm going to make is that since the title of the paper and of this webinar is more than just about siting, the title is rather about federal transmission policy. I want to just emphasize for those looking at what really is the most important thing for the next administration, barring legislation, I think it is a new comprehensive FERC transmission planning rule, just as Cheryl was describing a second ago. And I'll say more about that later if we have time. But let me walk through the points of the paper. First of all, couldn't agree more that decarbonization and utility goals and renewable policies require a significant amount of transmission. Our estimates are that we need 2 to 3 times the delivery capacity that we currently have. That is a massive amount of new transmission. Now, it doesn't mean we need that many new lines necessarily, because the efficiency of new lines means maybe it's 50 to 100% more lines, but 200 to 300% more capacity. This is shown by all sorts of experiences around the world and with various studies. The paper did note there's a couple dissenting voices among the studies, but those studies actually did not look at the hourly granularity, which you really need in order to assess this question, because people are familiar that renewables are remote. For example, 88% of the renewable energy capacity is in 15 central region states. So people kind of get that, okay, it's far away from population centers, but the equally important aspect is the fact that power needs to move back and forth within and across regions in order to meet load 87, 60 hours a year. That SEAM study that Justin mentioned, if you look closely, it actually has close to 40 gigawatts of power moving between the eastern and western interconnections at different times. And then equally importantly, it moves back the other direction. So it actually, since wind and solar tend to operate at different times and places, you find this dynamic all over the country where the power moves in the tens of gigawatts across one area and then back the other way. And this is, of course, nothing new for transmission planners. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Pacific DC intertie. If we're talking about federal leadership on transmission, if you look at how that line is used, you often find just on a daily basis, 1,500 megawatts go in one direction and 500 megawatts going back the other direction. And these days, that's largely driven by excess solar from California during the day, shipping up to be stored as hydro behind dams in the Northwest and then shipped back down when the sun goes down. So that large movement of power is definitely needed. Agree with that. And then I'll just tick through some of the other key points in the paper with which I very much agree. We absolutely need federal leadership. I would love to see it at the presidential level, maybe an executive order. I agree that meaningful authorities exist, particularly with these we're talking about today, 1221 and 1222, and they should be used. I agree that generally the type of transmission we're talking about, the large regional and interregional transmission, is generally not getting built today, despite total investment numbers being fairly high, over 20 billion a year. That's a problem. We've got renewable projects piling up in interconnection queues. And as Cheryl noted when she was a commissioner, you can do queue reform all day, but if you're not proactively building the transmission, there's just not really a way out of that. Also agree with the paper about the use of grid enhancing technologies. Those are very promising now, so incentives and grants would be helpful. We can use existing corridors more. I agree with the legal interpretations of these provisions, though I'm the only non-lawyer, I think, here, so don't ask me about that. But I did have the pleasure of working with a number of lawyers over the years on these issues: Gene Grace, Jim Hecker, Joe Kelleher, and what I'm reading here is consistent with what I've always heard. And I think I'm out of time. Definitely agree that power marketing administrations could be leaders here and should be, and I hope they will be. So I might just note, in addition to the FERC planning rule, I might have seen more about FAST Act implementation. Maybe Lauren can talk about her experience with interagency transmission work, but that model started under the Obama administration. Later in the FAST Act, I think has been actually pretty successful and should be highlighted and used and staffed up. And the one thing I would quibble with in terms of the implementation of these authorities, and maybe we can talk about this, is whether it would be wise for DOE to do this sort of proactive designation of these corridors right up front, as opposed to sort of staffing up, clarifying authorities, both DOE and FERC, and then being ready for applications from developers to say, hey, look, I've got these choke points. Here's how my project fits the 1221 criteria. I think my own preference would be for that approach, because it usually does come down to choke points, and the political opposition generated by sort of proactive, generic, broad designations, I think might be a headache that nobody really needs. So I'll leave it at that, Michael, and turn it to you.
Thanks very much, Rob. Our final speaker before the Q&A period is Lauren Azar. She provides legal and consulting services in the electric industry, providing business, regulatory, and policy advice, as well as project development and permitting. Among other things, she's currently assisting utilities to develop a path to deep decarbonization and working within the footprint of the Midwestern Independent System Operator, MISO, to improve transmission planning and cost allocation. Lauren served as senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Energy from 2011 to 2013, advising him on the electric industry and the institutional barriers that it faces. She also co-led negotiations among 9 federal agencies to overhaul and streamline their evaluation of electric transmission. From 2007 to 2011, Lauren was a commissioner on the Wisconsin Public Service Commission. Lauren.
Thank you very much, Michael. And let me just start off with congratulations to the authors on this article. It really is outstanding. I'm going to sort of go through a staccato of ideas here, because I've got probably less than 5 minutes given the timing of things. So let's just start off with, I agree 100% with Cheryl's note that state support, no matter where we go, is going to make this a whole lot easier. But I don't think that's sufficient. And Cheryl used the MVPs at MISO as an example, and I led the process for those MVPs. And I can tell you that the threat of federal backstop siting actually was in existence at that point in time, and it pretty seriously helped us get the MVPs through. So I think having a robust federal backstop siting would be quite helpful, even if it's never used, if the state regulators knew that that was a threat. Interestingly enough, I'm going to tell a little bit of a funny story. Was just in a process where about 45 people were discussing whether federal eminent domain was going to be needed to essentially site this macro grid, which is not just interregional lines, but interconnected regional lines that connect the weather patterns in the US. And 100% of the participants said, yes, we are going to need federal eminent domain for that. But once we started to talk about implementing the 2 authorities that provide federal eminent domain, nobody wanted to trigger it. So I think that just underscores the political difficulties of actually using federal eminent domain. As I think almost everybody said here, the power marketing administrations could be an incredibly useful way to get this done quickly. It will not be easy. And as noted in the article, the most critical component is to make sure that the PMA's preference customers are not at all impacted by the implementation of, for instance, the Section 1222 authorities or the Transmission Infrastructure Program at WAPA. And in fact, as the article notes, the beauty of the Plains and Eastern project is that they actually agreed to provide 2% of their revenues to essentially drive down the rates of the preference customers. So not only were the preference customers not harmed, they were benefited by the Plains and Eastern project. Nevertheless, I can tell you it's difficult to get traction at the PMAs because of the preference customers, because of the congressional delegation's powers, and because of powers within the DOE. The Department of Energy is decidedly not a regulatory agency. And they actually are the regulators of the PMAs. And so that's a muscle that they need to essentially strengthen, is how to work with the PMAs so that the PMAs are indeed using their congressional given authorities for the national good. Let's see. The one last thing I wanted to talk about, and Rob referenced this, I think besides the citing challenges that the article is about, one of the key problems we have right now, and Cheryl also referred to this, is the weak nexus between the parties who would like to develop a national transmission plan and those who could actually get built. Right now, we've got a lot of people actually doing conceptual designs for a national grid. We need the parties who actually can get down and do the designs of a national grid. But as importantly, whoever does those designs of the national grid need to be able to obligate parties to build it and to provide cost allocation for it. That nexus right now is very weak. I think Rob mentioned that we need presidential support for this, and I would be as bold as to ask President-elect Biden to convene the CEOs of the RTOs, ISOs, the commissioners at FERC, the PMA administrators, and the governors of states to say, look, we've got this problem. We need a national grid. We need to design it, and we need to obligate parties to build it. And you all figure out how you're going to do that and come back in 3 months with a plan on how you're going to get it done. And with that, I will leave it to you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. We have 22 minutes for a whole lot of questions. And so I'm going to ask the members of the panel to keep their responses to 30 or 45 seconds if possible. So first, we're getting a significant number of questions about the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. First, how do we move through NEPA more quickly and effectively? Will the Trump administration's changes to the NEPA regulations help accelerate this process? And how could NEPA be further reformed by the Biden administration to accelerate the building out of the grid? Who would like to start with that?
I think I probably can. I led 9 federal agencies on streamlining the federal NEPA process over those agencies specifically for transmission. The FAST-41 Act, which Rob referenced, has been quite successful. You know, I helped to design the streamlining efforts, and then when I came out into private practice, I think had the first transmission project to go through the FAST-41 process, and it worked very well. Did there need to be changes? Absolutely. This is not rocket science. The bottom line is a schedule has to be designed, and it has to be met. And probably the biggest difficulty for this is that the federal agencies, whoever is the lead agency in the NEPA process, doesn't necessarily like to be the bird dog of other federal agencies. So there are ways in which you could shift that responsibility, but we don't need to get into those details now. So FAST-41 works. We need it to be extended, and we do need some tweaks.
I think big picture, if you look at the new administration, it's going to be important that any efforts they take to improve environmental review or strengthen environmental review of gas pipelines and oil pipelines and fossil fuel related projects not somehow spill over and make it harder to build transmission lines for renewable projects. Because I think there's a little bit of a schizophrenia on this. People want to strengthen NEPA and strengthen greenhouse gas review and so forth for gas pipelines while facilitating electric transmission. And I think it's important that the federal government really look at how it can help projects get built, not just, slow down the ones that some people might not want. I think that there's a lot that the federal government can do through the land and water agencies and so forth, but it has to be an objective. I'm worried that they'll just throw money at things, with like stimulus, infrastructure money, when private money wants to build these lines. Money's not the problem. It's the authority to build them that's the problem. So it's a little bit of a delineating what's where you might need to, some people might think they need to strengthen NEPA versus get things done faster.
Anyone else want to comment on the NEPA issue?
Michael, I will just throw in I can't resist but to comment on this. I completely agree with what Lauren and Cheryl said. I think there is a real risk that in terms of the reaction being that everything that the Trump administration has done on NEPA needs to be thrown out the door, that some of the NEPA reforms, that the new administration might well throw out things having to do with NEPA reforms that will really backfire when it comes to building new transmission. And they need to think long and hard about some of the NEPA reforms that were done and save a lot of them, in my view. I think there is that NEPA is something where you look at as we mentioned it, and as is noted in the article, it was 3 years on the Clean Line Plains and Eastern project, and DOE is certainly an agency that knows how to do complicated NEPA analysis. It does this on a lot of the environmental cleanup projects. It has an expert staff about NEPA, and even at that, it took 3 years. And then you have litigation coming after it. So it's my view is a very strong need for reform in that area.
Great, thank you. We've received a significant number of questions about technologies, many of them focusing on undergrounding and on offshore wind. So I'd like to ask, do EPAct 1222 and Section 216 provide guidance or opportunity for other electricity infrastructure that serves the power sector, for example, CO2 or hydrogen pipelines? And there's a related matter, does moving transmission lines underground make sense in any parts of the US? Would this help improve the efficiency of the system or reduce opposition? And can these authorities support the integration of offshore wind?
I'll start if you want. I do not think that those laws relate to moving hydrogen or moving carbon dioxide. The Federal Power Act is pretty confined to transporting electricity. You'd have to look at the Interstate Commerce Act possibly, or others for more, and I'd have to look back at it to see if it covers more than just oil pipelines and railroads, but that has, I think, more plenary interstate authority than the Federal Power Act. I do think that the siting authorities that the article talks about could be applied to underground transmission, and for HVDC, the cost premium of undergrounding is not as high as for AC transmission. So I think that could certainly be part of a FERC backstop approval or a 1222 approval. And I also think it could be applied to offshore wind, not so much for a specific interconnection for one project, but if there was a need for more of an offshore grid as they have in Europe.
So one point that we make in the paper is that Section 1222 has to date not had any appropriated funds to back it. I think that if they see interest in this program, DOE should work with Congress to try and get some appropriated funds. And one way that those funds could be deployed would be, strategically burying HVDC lines in sensitive areas if that were necessary, which is not to say that the developers couldn't undertake that expense on their own, but having a little bit of extra money to make that happen could be very useful. For offshore wind, which is an area where I practice in a lot now, the federal government already has the authority to site transmission in federal waters. It's the last, I think, 3 miles that are state waters that are subject to state siting authority. In the northeastern states, that's not really been the issue. Those states are eager to make those projects work. It's very often difficult to find good sites to interconnect. There's a lot of network upgrade costs that need to get done in coordination with the ISOs, but to date, we have not seen the same kind of problem of obstacles at the state level when it comes to offshore wind transmission permitting.
One thing I will note on that, Michael, is that I don't know how the cost of undergrounding high voltage transmission lines compares to the overhead lines today. I do know that when I was at DOE, I asked Steve Wright, the administrator of the Bonneville Power Administration, about that once, and the number, this was back in 07 or 08, it was dramatically higher. So it's not a matter of, well, you know, it's about the same. I mean, it was multiples higher for undergrounding high voltage transmission. And I think too, and going back to the comment that I think Cheryl mentioned, having to do with we do have to keep in mind, it's not as if, you know, natural gas pipelines are underground. I mean, it's not exactly like those are without opposition. So I think burying lines, yeah, I mean, they're not overhead, but it's not like that's in my view, probably going to significantly mitigate opposition in a number of these landowner cases.
Thank you. We've received a large number of questions from the audience about speed, that is the speed of infrastructure buildouts. If we follow suggestions in the report, could projects like Clean Line be successfully built? And if we're optimistic, how quickly could they be built? Also, can ERCOT in Texas help us by building more transmission lines and then allowing for more exports? And what about existing rights of way? Could we use those to speed things up?
Well, I can start. There are actually quite a lot of planned lines around the country that are pretty much ready to go. So, I think if there is congressional consideration of an infrastructure bill or some type of stimulus, since I would think many people would be interested in infrastructure that helps with climate purposes. I think transmission should be eligible for that, and the old shovel-ready standard from the Recovery Act actually would include a lot of transmission around the country that is well through the permitting process. I do think that is an opportunity. I mean, longer term, you know, most transmission does take closer to 10 years than, 0 to 5. And so I think what we see in the electric industry is a difficult dynamic where it seems like there's not all that much need for transmission because natural gas prices are low. Solar can be done closer to load. And so you actually don't see much congestion or cost variation, but that's really a temporary dynamic. By the end of this decade, we're going to see significant congestion everywhere. We see it in a lot of places already. Solar is going to need as much transmission as wind will. By then, you saturate certain areas and you need to move the power around. So we do need, in terms of timing, we do need to get these plans and cost allocation programs in place now so that we can get the lines built when we need it by the end of this decade, when we really need it by the end of this decade.
Anyone else want to chime in on this? Okay, we've received a number of questions about how the findings in this report can support the expansion of renewable power across the U.S. and the trade-offs involved in this process, including decarbonizing the power sector will require expansion of renewable energy in the U.S. Expanding the grid often does environmental damage. How do we minimize the damage? Do the studies indicate that we will still need long-distance transmission lines if we have decentralized, community-based microgrids? And could federal backstop authority also give more of a green light to fracked gas pipeline projects in addition to transmission line projects that would carry clean energy? In other words, is that a double-edged sword?
I guess I will start. FERC already has plenary authority over gas pipeline projects. In fact, far more robust than the backstop authority that 216 sought to give them over electric transmission. So I don't think reviving 216 will increase FERC's authority over gas pipelines. I do think things that you do with respect to NEPA could be a double-edged sword, since there's pieces of the environmental community wanting to strengthen NEPA and others wanting to make NEPA, streamline NEPA to help with transmission and renewable projects. So that would have to be thought through carefully. But I think the answer lies in assuring that NEPA consider not just the local impacts of any project, but the overall climate impacts of the projects that the project facilitates. That's what would differentiate a gas pipeline, which would presumably facilitate the combustion of fossil fuels, although might also replace more climate unfriendly, fossil fuels. You'd have to really look at it project by project, from a electric transmission line that would presumably reduce greenhouse gas consumption if you really looked fully through NEPA at the climate impact. So I think that's where you'd have to make the distinction. Finally, my own opinion, I'm interested in hearing on others. I think we definitely still need a backbone high voltage transmission grid in addition to localized microgrids. Most of the microgrids we have now really make their money and are able to exist because of participation in the regional markets, which is what they do the vast majority of the time when they're not islanded due to a storm. I think that we have two competing things, more regionalization and more localization, and we're going to need both sources of supply to decarbonize on anything like the timetables that have been set out as goals.
Yeah, I'll just
I
add, we need the microgrids for certain customers, more for their own sort of personal or corporate resilience, or hospitals or police stations or things like that. But that is unrelated to decarbonizing the bulk power system. We need, again, to move tens of gigawatts across and between regions in order to have a reliable 87, 60-hour power supply with high penetration renewables.
Quick
And to
point.
give-
What we're talking about here is
Sam and then Lauren.
sorry.
Sam?
Just quick point. What we're talking about here is sort of a planned, intentional, national scale approach that uses as much as possible high voltage and HVDC lines. What that actually results in many fewer transmission line miles being needed to achieve our purposes, right? The higher voltage you go, the less total steel you need. So I think that that's something that we got to keep in mind. It's hard for people to understand, sort of like, if you're building one project that obviates the needs for all kinds of other ones, but it's really true when we're talking about these high voltage projects.
Lauren?
Yeah, I was just going to say, do we need DERs and microgrids? Absolutely, but that's not going to eliminate the need for this macro grid. To give you an idea, assuming economy-wide electrification, we are looking at 2 to 3 times the amount of generation that we have now. At least that's what the experts are saying. And it will likely be, a lot of it will be renewables. As ways in which to minimize the environmental impacts of the transmission that's needed, number one, we can use existing corridors where there are, for instance, coal plants that are retiring. There are great substations there. We can use those facilities. There was a huge transmission build out in the 60s and 70s. Those assets are now aging out. And so rather than replacing those with like-kind facilities, those can be either used for this macro grid, or they can be used for a much higher voltage the AC underlying grid that's going to be necessary to support the DC macro grid. So bottom line is there's lots of opportunities and ways in which we can minimize the environmental impacts of building out the needed macro grid.
Thank you. We only have about 5 minutes left, but quickly, another set of questions concerns FERC Order 1000, which has already been mentioned. Do you think that FERC Order 1000 has been successful so far? If FERC were to amend the order or issue a new order building on it, what specific changes to the planning and coordination processes should FERC make? How should those changes be designed to be effective, both in or outside of ISO RTO regions? And would additional authorizations be required to connect North Atlantic offshore wind power to interregional HVDC lines? Anybody want to tackle any of those?
Well, I'll start, I guess. I think FERC Order number 1000 has been a mixed success. It has helped some projects get built. We have seen successfully competitively bid projects in every ISO. We have seen, for example, the building of transmission in the New York ISO that was enabled by the cost allocation processes that were put out in order number 1000. So it has been somewhat of a success in the intra-regional transmission space. I think, as I said earlier, the opposition to the competitive bidding and the removal of the right of first refusal has hampered the success of order number 1000. Just to pick up on something Lauren said, under order number 1000, if you replace a facility like for like, you don't have to bid it out. But if you replace a bunch of little facilities with a big new thing, you do have to bid it out. So incumbents have a tendency to like things they don't have to bid out. So that's been a problem. I think FERC should do continue what's the record that was built way back in 2016 by building more of a record, really looking at what happens in each region, and probably doing a set of surgical things to the regional planning and then taking a broader look at interregional. But that's just a one sentence answer. I think there's plenty to work on. I don't think they can entirely solve the right of first refusal barriers, but I think they can look at ways to amend that to make some of these projects happen better.
Yeah, I agree with that very much. And again, it will soon have been 10 years since Order 1000. And I don't look at it as just sort of fixing Order 1000. I think if you can look back at Order 888, 2000, 890, and 1000, you see a series over 25 years of increasing attempts to regionalize by FERC. Some of the various provisions worked, some didn't work as well, but we've got a large gap between where we need to be and where we are. It's time, if not over time, to improve on what's in place now. I can't disagree with Cheryl on the ROFR aspect of that, but in terms of what it should do, the most important thing I think is just plan for the future. I mean, turn the headlights on and incorporate what everybody already knows about the evolving resource mix. You can see it in utilities goals, in state policies, in corporate customers' purchases, and yet regional transmission planning processes around the country are operating completely oblivious to all that information. And it should just be incorporated, just like we incorporate load growth and estimate other factors when we quote unquote plan other things.
I'll just say one second thing. A lot of FERC right now, it looks like it's going to be a majority Republican FERC with a Democratic chairman for a while, depending on things we don't know of how long people stay and so forth. And there's a lot of things that FERC, on which FERC is deeply divided. Transmission planning is not one, because FERC hasn't acted on it for such a long time. There's not a lot of calcified disagreements among the existing and brand new commissioners. So it's a ripe time to look at it.
So although the transmission planning and siting process takes a very long time, this panel has sped by, and unfortunately we have reached the witching hour. I want to thank all of our speakers and panelists for joining us today. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the CJEP website in a few days. CJEP's next event is a discussion with David Victor and Danny Cullenward about their new book, Making Climate Policy Work. It will be held this Wednesday, December 16th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. For a full calendar of events, please visit the CJEP website online. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.